us today. He has a PhD from UC Berkeley. He's written over 600 different scientific articles. He's written 8 books. He is the founder and director of Alert. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Bill. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you for going to all the trouble for setting this up and several different room numbers that it got moved to various times. It's good that we all ended up at the right place. It's great to be back at UQ. I'm sorry some of my friends and occasional partners in crime haven't been able to make it today. So Martine Marone and James Watson and Hugh Possingham, people I know Hugh's kind of moved on, but anyway, enjoy interacting with a lot whenever I come here to UQ, but I still have other friends and partners in crime here. So April Reside, many others that are good to talk to. I'm going to talk about an issue that I think we all have been hearing about. It's transcended sort of the scientific discussions to move into the popular literature. You really can't pick up a newspaper, watch TV, go online, do anything without hearing about this sort of tsunami of infrastructure, of roads, railways, transportation projects, extractive industries, mines, dams, water projects, energy projects. Everywhere we look, we are seeing really an unprecedented avalanche of change happening. And we are living without any question at all in the most ambitious and dynamic and challenging era of, I think, environmental change in human history. In fact, I think that this infrastructure tsunami is not only a driver of a lot of the things that we think of as major changes, such for instance as climate change, but I think it's actually, if you actually single it out, it's the most important change that we're facing right now, the most important challenge, and it's everywhere. We focus mostly on developing countries, mostly tropical countries, so that's kind of the way I tend to see the world, but these issues are striking everywhere, and if you don't believe me, pick up this morning's Courier Mail or the Australian, and you'll see the headline article is screaming about the idea that a little bird, insignificant little bird, happens to be a highly endangered, highly specialized black-throated finch. April Reside can tell you all about it. Is complicating the progress of the Adani coal mine. And the papers, of course conservative papers, are screaming that the radical anti-coal environmentalists are complicating jobs and economic progress for that. And what I'd like to do is talk about how this kind of reality is playing out. I'm going to focus, again, a lot on developing countries for reasons that I'll explain. But through the prism of a particular species, because I think that these issues are so big and they're so complicated and so multifaceted that in a way it helps to be able to identify it and talk about a species and say how is this playing out for a particular species. But I'll talk a little bit more generally about just the modern infrastructure tsunami that we're living in right now. Again, overwhelmingly it's the most dramatic era of infrastructure expansion in human history. Current mainstream suggestions indicate that we should be spending $3 to $5 trillion per year on infrastructure in order to meet human needs, things like food security and population growth and all the other issues that are being claimed by things like the Sustainable Development Goals. If we do that, for the next 15 to 20 years, we'll essentially double the amount of infrastructure on the planet Earth. Now, that's not necessarily saying that's happening, and in fact, I would argue that that's not necessarily saying that that would be wise for that scale of investment to happening for reasons that we'll talk about. But those are the kinds of numbers that are being talked about and are being thrown out by mainstream organizations. I mean, all the mainstream international organizations and across the board are saying those kinds of things. The current projections, for instance, suggest that roads, that we could see an increase in 25 million kilometers of additional paved roads by 2050. That's an incredible, enough to encircle the world more than 600 times. Another thing that we really have to emphasize, and I tend to talk a lot about roads because in many ways they're kind of a common denominator, and we know that when you open up an area with roads, it changes everything. It's sort of a Pandora's box of all kinds of environmental changes, but there's social changes, economic changes, land use changes, everything is changed by physical accessibility, and it's especially determined by roads. But a really important thing to realize is that almost every kind of project, and we're talking about extractive industries like mining and oil and gas, or energy projects like hydroelectric dams, or almost any kind of human development project requires roads. And so they really become the thing that links all these things together. This is just one example here from Brazil. First, we can take a quick look. If you can see all these little red and yellow dots here, these are planned or under progress hydro dams, major hydro dams, occurring within the Brazilian Amazon, or excuse me, occurring within the Amazon Basin or the Andean Piedmont of South America. So there's more than 300 of these projects that are planned or underway. So we're talking about major expansion of projects, oftentimes in very deep forested and pristine and remote areas. Now here's one example here. Here's the Tucuruí Dam from Brazil. By the way, say hi to John Paul Metzger, my old friend from Brazil. Meu amigo. But you can see here the Tucuruí Dam. When this originally went in, it was mostly forest. There were a few local populations, a few indigenous people living in this area. And then you can see what it looks like today. Here's the footprint of the dam, and you can see this huge network of roads. So you can't build a hydroelectric dam with all the thousands of tons of concrete and other kinds of heavy material without roads for accessing the dam and without maintaining the dam, and also for high tension power lines and other kinds of things that you're going to need to be associated with the dam infrastructure. So we tend to talk about these big projects, whether it's a big mine or it's a hydroelectric dam or whatever it might be, as an anchoring project, because oftentimes it's providing that anchor, that economic impetus, and for road construction, okay? Because that's, again, the critical denominator. One recent study that came out I thought was very informative looked at the 50 largest industrial mining projects in the Brazilian Amazon, and they looked at the actual lease area of the mine, and these are big projects with lots of mining, big footprint of mining, open pit mines, lots of overburden, lots of mine tailings, really big projects. And they asked how much deforestation was caused within the mining concession area versus outside of the area, but along the roads that were constructed to access the mine. They found 12 times more deforestation associated, and it's usually illegal deforestation, associated with the roads built to get to the mine than in the mine project, these giant industrial mines themselves. So it just gives you an idea. It's these indirect impacts, and it's the impacts of the infrastructure, especially the roads, that are oftentimes so profound and powerful in terms of opening up the world's last surviving wild places, in terms of endangering biodiversity, in terms of just really causing profound changes everywhere we look. And one thing to emphasize, most of this is happening in developing countries. Of course, these are nations that need economic and social development. There's absolutely no way to get around that. And we can't even start the conversation unless we start with what is good development, what are good investments, what are smart investments and sustainable investments. But again, about 9/10 of this is happening in developing nations, and everywhere we look, we're seeing incredible change. And quite frankly, if you think there's a lot happening in Australia, go anywhere, just about, in the tropics, from Indonesian New Guinea to Borneo to the Brazilian Amazon to Equatorial Africa. There are explosions of things happening, and they're happening very, very rapidly. Here's an example here, the Congo Basin. This is a place I grew up sort of thinking is a great wild area. Read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It's one of these, magnificent, the second largest rainforest on Earth. This is what the Congo looked like in 2007 when Nadine Laporte and her group looked at the major roads that you could map out using remote sensing there. And they found that within about the last 10 years, that they're getting that little pointer there, within about the last 10 years, there was about 50,000 kilometers of new major roads that had been constructed in the Congo. And it turns out that even if you zoom in on little areas here that you can't necessarily, like if you look at that little circle, you don't really see roads there, but if you use high resolution techniques, in fact, you do pick up a lot of logging roads. You just don't see them unless you get in with the specialized high resolution techniques. As a consequence of this avalanche of road building in the Congo Basin, in concert with commercial and subsistence hunters who now have much more lethal technologies than they ever had. They've got automatic rifles and they've got cable and wire snares. We have seen an invasion into the Congo Basin species that require wild places to survive, such as the forest elephant, which is found only in these rainforest areas. It's not like the savanna elephant, it's a separate species. Their global population has collapsed by 2/3 in the last decade. Okay? There's almost no place for them to hide anymore. Okay? Everything is being opened up. They need some places without humans, and especially, of course, without the modern depredations of humans, with the rifles and the snares and everything else that they bring with them, in order to survive. So what I want to do is kind of quickly talk about a couple of things. The impacts, I'm going to focus again on roads because they're the sort of common denominator, but remembering, of course, that all kinds of developments happening, but again, the roads are oftentimes both the cause and the consequence of a lot of things that are going on. So some direct impacts of the roads and also some indirect impacts of roads. And these are kind of obvious things I think we all know about. You know when you put in a road that you get some habitat loss. This is, for example, a road built in Panama, central Panama, for a gold mine, and industrial gold mine. And you lost, a few dozen meters of habitat along the sides of that road. So that's a direct impact of the road. We also know, for instance, in tropical environments that when you juxtapose, remember, a rainforest has a very specialized microclimate. It's humid and it's dark and moist, it has very little wind, a highly specialized microenvironment that has persisted for tens of millions of years, and many, many species have become specialized for living under those very unique kinds of microclimatic conditions. And you put that right next to a road which has got a much harsher, sunnier, hotter, completely different kinds of microclimate. When you put those two kinds of things, very physically different environments right next to each other, you're going to get a lot of change, a lot of spillover, so-called edge effects. And right here at the zero would be where our road would be, or some kind of a clearing. This is all work coming out of the fragmentation project in Brazil that we've been working with for quite a long time. These different things here are all different kinds of physical and biotic edge effects that are penetrating into the forest for, in some cases, hundreds of meters into the inside of the forest along the edges of roads or clearings. So what we're seeing are these, even around the road itself, we're seeing these halos of environmental change, and they're affecting everything from forest dynamics to disturbance regimes to sensitive species to invasive species to all kinds of things. So there's a lot of changes associated with these so-called edge effects. We know that there's roadkill. Now, some of the early work has tended to think of roadkill as something being a relatively minor or modest cause of mortality in species. Some of the demographic models are just suggesting that for certain kinds of species, in fact, particularly when you start to get higher road densities, that having a reasonable number of roads may in fact be enough to tip species right into extinction because of the higher mortality. Now, they're not all species, but we know that certain kinds of species tend to move slowly, they tend to freeze in front of car headlights, they tend to forage on roads, they tend to bask on roads, things like that. So they tend to be highly vulnerable in many cases to roadkill. And so that can be an important cause of mortality for them, not for all. And then this is some work from my wife's Susan Lawrence's work in the Amazon for her PhD. Actually, one of the things that we've discovered is even relatively narrow roads, surprisingly, can actually form a barrier. And not just sort of a partial barrier, but actually, in some cases, an absolute barrier to gene flow and to demographic movement. One of the things that Sue did for her work is she put radio collars or bands on birds. And one of the things that you could find, turns out that some of these specialized understory birds in the rainforest, they live on one territory for their entire life, a fixed territory. They don't migrate or anything. They stick right on that territory, and they mate with one individual for their entire life. Absolutely monogamous. Okay, so you can take one of those birds and you can catch it, and you can move it like 3 kilometers away inside the rainforest, and it will be back on its territory. If not that same day, then by the next day. Always. I mean, every single time they did it. They always go home. You can take that same bird and you can put it on the other side of a 100-meter wide clearing, which is about what you'd be associating with a highway. And not with a lot of deforestation or anything, just with the footprint of a highway. And they'll move up and down the edge of that clearing, and they will not go back. And you can't imagine any animal having a more profound motivation to move than coming back to its permanent territory and its permanent mating. So clearly, that kind of thing could stop. And we know from demographic studies that there's a giant difference between a little bit of movement and no movement at all, demographically and genetically. And this appears that these roads and the associated clearings can actually stop
and fragment populations of some specialized species. That is important. Now, those are just the direct consequences of roads. And actually, what I would argue that is, and I think it's a strong case, is that in fact it's not the direct effects that are the most dangerous at all. It's the indirect effects, the so-called secondary effects. One, of course, of which is hunters. This is one of the things that we see in almost everywhere we look, where roads are opening up frontier areas or new areas, areas of forest, is incursions of hunters, especially, well, not so much in the New World tropics for reasons that nobody understands, but in Africa and Asia, when people hunt with snares. And cable and wire are ubiquitous, they're cheap, everybody has them, and it's one of the things that you find everywhere. It's just you walk along, or you move along the roads and you find these snares everywhere. And also automatic rifles. I mean, it's incredible. I don't know how many people have been to places like the Congo, but you just see almost everybody walking around with just like, you know, an AK-47 or an automatic. I mean, it's just astonishing, the number of weapons you see. This is an elephant. This is a skeleton of an elephant we found in one of the largest national parks in Congo, Ndoki, sorry, I forget the last name, Ndoki Valley National Park. That used to be a pretty safe national park for wildlife. Then a logging company built a road along the southern border of the park, and ever since that happened, they've had a real problem with poachers with automatic weapons coming into the park. And this was an elephant that was shot by poachers, and the body was dumped into the main water hole that the wildlife relied on for water there in that park. And the park rangers dragged the elephant out of it in order to stop it from sort of polluting the water. And this is kind of the classical signature that you see with poached elephants. You can see here its face has been hacked off. This is what they do. They use machetes and they chop off its face. So this is just the absolute signature. Whenever you find an elephant skeleton, and you do find these, you know it's been killed by poachers, because they want to get the tusks, the ivory tusks, and they want to get the whole tusk, the base of the tusk too, so they chop the face off in order to pull those tusks out. So absolutely undoubtable signature of poaching, and again, that's been responsible for wiping out in a decade 2/3 of the world's living forest elephants. Deforestation, of course, is another big thing. In the Brazilian Amazon, for instance, we knew that there was a really strong association between where roads are and where deforestation occurs. We did an early study years ago and looked at that correlation, and we found this pretty strong relationship here. But you can see a lot of scatter around that. And then we're a little bit slow, but we finally figured out, really, if we want to try to look at the relationship between roads and deforestation, we can't just look at the legal roads, which were on the maps. We also needed to look at where the illegal roads were too. And so what we ended up doing was actually mapping painstakingly by hand all the illegal roads as well as the legal roads. And it turns out there's about 3 kilometers of illegal road for every 1 kilometer of legal road in the Brazilian Amazon. And when you do that, you find not that you get this sort of very loose relationship, as you can see in that yellow graph there. You get an incredibly tight statistical relationship between roads and deforestation. What you find is that 95% of all deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon occurs within 5.5 kilometers of a legal or illegal road. If you want to know where deforestation is going to occur, if you want to know where it's going to happen in the future, if you want to manage it, if you want to reduce it, if you want to plan it, it's all about knowing where the roads are, or limiting the roads, or managing the roads. That is almost the entire story of deforestation in the Amazon, and it happens in many other parts of the world too. There's a reason why, after almost 40 years of doing this stuff, that we're focusing so much on roads. And of course, this is associated with a lot of other changes. It's not just impacts on biodiversity and indigenous peoples and lots of other things. It's also things like, of course, ecosystem processes that affect the planet. We know that, for instance, that greenhouse gas emissions from tropical deforestation are roughly equivalent to the entire global transportation sector. So 12–15% of all global carbon emissions are coming from that. So non-trivial. Now, of all the different things that are happening in infrastructure, and there's a lot of them, the biggest, overwhelmingly, not the 900, the 9,000-pound gorilla in the corner is the so-called Belt and Road, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. How many people have heard about the Belt and Road? Actually, could someone in the room who has not heard about the Belt and Road raise their hand? All right, 1, 2, 3, that was a few, okay. Well, most of you have heard about the Belt and Road. If you haven't, you have now. The Belt and Road is being proposed by China. Well, it's not being proposed, it's happening. As it's currently manifested, it will span about 130 nations, 129 if you go onto China's official Belt and Road website. Turns out that the state of Victoria in Australia has formally partnered with the Belt and Road, so we don't know whether to call Australia a partner or not. If you do, then it's 130 nations that are officially now part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It spans the entire planet. Originally, it was designed to essentially connect China using the old Silk Road routes, which are what linked China with Europe and other parts of South Asia. But also, it was then going to also link into Africa and the Middle East. Subsequently, early last year, China announced that it was also going to include the Central America, South America, and the Caribbean region. China is also now talking about a Polar Silk Road, which is going to involve major infrastructure, ports, transportation infrastructure, and other shipping infrastructure designed to open up shipping routes across the polar region in the north as these new routes are increasingly opened up because of global warming. China's also got major claims now on Antarctica and is putting major infrastructure into Antarctica. It will not be long before China claims Antarctica, even though it's not an official party, it's not an official Antarctic nation. I think you can take this to the bank. It will not be long before China claims major territorial ambitions and plans for the Antarctica, because Chinese investment right now in Antarctic everything, including infrastructure, is overwhelming every other nation put together. So China's, including mineral rights, fisheries, all the things that go along with that, those kinds of moving into those kinds of territorial increases. Total projections, the numbers are hard to try to define, but the current numbers suggest that it may be on the order of $8 trillion in total investment, but these numbers are very fuzzy. And something like on the order of 7,000 different infrastructure and extractive industry projects, but again, these numbers are very, very rough. And potentially $8 trillion US dollars. And just to sort of picture this, because I think these numbers can kind of get lost in our mind. If you take US dollars, a $100 US dollar bill, and you put 100 of those on top of each other, so you got $10,000, you end up with a pile that's a little bit more than a centimeter thick, okay? And if you do that, and you want to make $1 trillion, you have to have an area. That's essentially what it looks like. What is it, like a football field, a footy pitch, maybe two? I don't know. That's $1 trillion, okay? That's the kind of scale of investment we're talking about under a single nation's initiative. Now, we have been prominent critics of the Belt and Road. I don't make any bones about that. We're well known for that, and some parties don't especially appreciate it. Why? As part of this Belt and Road initiative, and I'll give you a little more of the history on it, there's been a rain of policy documents. China's anticipated that people would be worried, and that one of the big worries would be around environment. So there have been some steps that have been taken. They've been trying to open up some green credits. There have been a variety of white papers produced that have all kinds of wonderful, I mean, if you read them, and if you believe them, you would say, my goodness me, there's all these wonderful environmental social guidelines. It just sounds great, and it has a very sustainable philosophy. By the way, Papua New Guinea also has absolutely wonderful legislation. If you go up there and you look at what's actually written in Papua New Guinea, boy, you'd say, my goodness, this must be one of the best run countries on the planet. If you go onto the ground in Papua New Guinea, you see a different reality. Same thing's happening in the Belt and Road. The species I wanted to talk about here was the newly discovered species of orangutan. Now, there's 8 species of great, well, there were 7. Sorry, there were 6. 7, yeah, this is 7. Yeah, this is the 7th species of great ape that's now known. It used to be thought, up until last year, that there were 2 species of orangutan in the world. There was the Borneo orangutan, and there was the Sumatran orangutan. Early last year, there was a new study that came out that showed that this southern population here, I'm getting problems getting this little white thing to move. All right, that little southern population right there was a completely genetically and morphologically and behaviorally and in every way different species of orangutan. It doesn't look the same, it doesn't behave the same, it's ecologically it's different. It's a completely new species. It's called the Tapanuli orangutan. it is now overwhelmingly, without doubt, the most critically endangered species of great ape on the planet, one of our closest living relatives. Less than 800 individuals are probably alive. It has a total geographic range about 1/10 the size of Sydney, Australia. Okay, so just to put that in perspective, most of its habitat's already been destroyed. One of the things that we did, because we'd actually just finished mapping all the illegal roads in northern Sumatra, we thought, well, why don't we go in and see what kind of environmental factors predict where this Tapanuli ape occurs and doesn't occur. And guess what we found? Of all the different things we could look at, roads were overwhelmingly the predictor. If there's a road there, you don't find the ape and you don't find its habitat. Okay? It only survives in the last places in this pocket of northern Sumatra where there are no roads left. So it's already got a fragmented habitat, and it's already under pressure from various kinds of activities, illegal logging, illegal mining, but most especially of all, from a absolutely Chinese-sponsored, funded hydropower dam called Batang Toru, which is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, so this is a $1.6 billion initiative. That might sound like a big thing. Actually, by the standards of the Belt and Road, this is a very small change. It's not, and if you look at how much energy would be produced for the amount of investment, it's actually among the worst on the entire planet. I mean, it's a very, very marginal project in every way you look at it. Geologically, tectonically, terrible area to build a project like this. I mean, it's an area that's extremely susceptible to earthquakes. Major constructor is Sino-Hydro, which is Chinese National Hydroelectric Authority. It's the world's biggest dam builder. They're building dams all over the planet, and it's being funded entirely by China, especially the Bank of China, but other Chinese investors and financiers. Okay, so this has got China's fingerprints, handprints, footprints all over it. It's also, of course, become embedded in Indonesia, and it now has, because of all the money that's floating around behind the scenes, Indonesian entities, and particularly in a corporation that was specifically founded. This is how it works in Indonesia. They use subsidiaries. A little subsidiary that was created to produce this project is now pushing this. We've been pretty, I think, central in terms of raising the profile on this, but this issue has completely taken off. A completely unique species of orangutan, and its global population is going to be chopped in half, the tiny surviving global population, by this new hydro project and all the infrastructure. Roads, high-tension power lines, tailings, overburden, everything else that's associated with this hydro project. So we did some stuff on alert, and it's been picked up by, we helped to sponsor a letter to the President of Indonesia, President Jokowi, by several letters by the coalition of scientists, and then it's been Friends of the Earth, or WALI in Indonesia, and especially the Sumatran Orangutan Conservation Program, which is a wonderful, it's the most credible program there. Avaz started up a petition, and in 1 week they had 1.3 million signatures. So this has been investigative reports now, as you can see, all different people, Nature, Manga Bay, Christian Science Monitor, National Geographic. A lot of people have paid attention to this issue. There has been as far as the scientific community can go, and as far as the conservation community can go, I've never seen a project where more attention and effort and lobbying has gone into one specific situation, one specific scenario for this absolutely critically endangered species of ape. If China was going to do an initiative that was going to be sustainable and environmentally, if there was one project you could stop in the name of trying to have a sustainable development initiative, this would be it. We haven't seen that. We have seen every form, the parties, the proponents have dug in. We have seen every form of insidious behavior, corruption. I cannot almost describe to you, it is overtly criminal, the things that have happened in terms of suppression of information, pressuring of news sources, pressuring of scientists, all kinds, I mean, it just almost beggars belief to me to imagine the kinds of stuff, really, there's just extreme dirty pool stuff that's been going on in Indonesia now. And this project is bulldozing ahead, okay? We haven't been able to stop it at all. So, that's a reality of the Belt and Road as it's playing out for a single species. So, more generally about this Belt and Road, and I have a lot of worries about it, I'd like to tell you a little bit about it sort of more generally. One is it's a lot less organized. Now, you're studying Belt and Roads safeguards. You're in Martine's lab. Sorry, what's your first name again? Vivia. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. We're going to talk later, because I know you're studying investor safeguards for Belt and Roads, so I have many things to talk about with you. But you will know, the Belt and Road is a lot less organized than people think. I mean, within China, outside of China. And there's a lot of tension if you go within Beijing about what the Belt and Road is going to be. One of the things that I think you can argue very emphatically is that it's going to be very, very difficult to try to control the environmental impacts of the Belt and Road projects. Many of them are going to be very large-scale projects that transcend multiple boundaries, like large railways or large highways or large transportation projects or new port projects or different kinds of facilities. And these are going to be spanning multiple jurisdictions and multiple boundaries, multiple national borders, and these kinds of projects tend to be, they don't even know which authority is in charge of it. I mean, the reality when you see these kinds of large-scale projects when they play out, the environmental, any kind of environmental, social, even safeguards for investors and for financiers and others are incredibly complex and difficult to implement. So there's really no single entity in charge or responsible for a lot of these projects. China's position consistently in promoting their projects has been this. Number one, they're not responsible. It's the host nation that should take responsibility. And two, it should be the host nation's environmental safeguards that really, whatever those happen to be. So let's just say, for instance, Indonesia, or it might be Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, or it might be Colombia, or whatever. It's that really that nation has the responsibility. The China's just going to do the project. And it's really on the host nation in order to worry about what the impacts would be. Another thing is, if you look at things like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is one of the biggest supporters of Belt and Road projects, and but it also it's a multilateral lender like the World Bank or the Asian Infrastructure Bank or African Development Bank under China. If you look at the way that they describe the projects they want to develop, they want them to be transformative. They want to basically take an area where you've got a log jam and you've got all this development that's ready to happen, and it's ready to flood into this area. All you got to do is punch a road through this one difficult piece of terrain, and once you do that, this whole new area is going to be opened up, and it's going to be transformative. Now, of course, it's all painted in wonderful terms, like, oh, it's going to be wonderful because we'll open up all this new land, and it'll be able to exploit it, and you'll be able to have more mining, and more logging, and more, farming, and all that type of thing. But that's the kinds of projects that they want to support, are transformative projects that really will have major environmental changes. That's what they're focusing on whenever they can. At least groups like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. One of my Chinese colleagues who's well plugged into this described it as anarchy. Okay, that came from someone who was being frank. There's no consensus about what the environmental guidelines are going to be. I mean, there have been these white papers that produced, but what you're actually seeing is a developing tension between larger Chinese corporations, and these are corporations that are large, they're multinational, they tend to have assets that would be held within host countries, and if they actually upset the host country enough, the host country could potentially seize some of their assets. And so they actually want to see some kind of environmental guidelines in place. But for every single one of those larger, really big corporations, you've got hundreds of smaller and medium-sized corporations in China, and they, generally speaking, don't want any kind of environmental, social, or other kinds of guidelines at all. They want to operate the way, in fact, that they've been operating all along. And I actually think that there's absolutely no way China is going to put any kind of real constraints on its overseas operators. It never has, and it's not going to start now. Now, if you guys follow Chinese history, those of you who understand what's happened, in the early 1990s, remember it was like in the 1980s when China first started to embrace capitalism, capitalism in a communist way. And then in the early 1990s, they had the so-called Going Global program. And that's when really they unleashed Chinese corporations to just move overseas in a very, very vigorous ways. That happened very shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's economy collapsed and society collapsed because of its top-down controlled economic enterprises. And China saw that, and they saw all this top-down control, and they said, there's no way. I mean, this was the thought process that went on. They said, there's no way we're going to do that. We're not going to repeat that mistake. We're going to just tell our people to go forth and, as Mao said, to be rich is glorious, to make money. Okay? When he said those words, to be wealthy is glorious, there were 1.3 billion Chinese nationals that said, my goodness me, those are words that we've been waiting to hear. And China, it's difficult to point to a particular nation, but there's nothing like China happening on the planet right now in terms of dynamics. And I'm focusing on the Chinese government, and the reality is they're not on the Chinese people. But when those words were said to a people that had not been allowed to do capitalism, and they were told that they were allowed to go abroad and that to be wealthy is glorious, and then there was essentially no guidelines. China has no national legislation against corruption, okay? In Australia, in the United States, in the UK, most nations, there's something like the Foreign Corrupt Businesses Act. There are laws that say if you engage in corruption, at least in theory, you should be liable as a corporation. In fact, in Australia, you've actually got the duty of care. It's your responsibility to make sure that that doesn't happen. China doesn't have anything like that. China also has no history for its corporations of any kind of openness, okay? Here in Australia, or everywhere else in the OECD countries, you've got to actually, a public corporation has to tell you how much money it's making, what its assets are, what its profits are, where its investments are going, what it's doing. China doesn't do any of that. It's all hidden in the shadows. And that's not me exaggerating. That's the reality. That's how it operates. As a nation and as an international force, that is the reality of what's playing out on the ground. And you've got this tsunami of change sweeping the planet, and that is the reality of how this is all happening. It's a perfect storm. It's all happening under President Xi Jinping. And one thing you have to understand is in China, if you go to China, and if I don't know if there's any Chinese nationals here, but if you talk to Chinese, quite frankly, even the Chinese expats in diaspora, quite frankly, when they talk about Belt and Road, they say, well, it's magnificent. It's China's gift to the world. It's this wonderful thing. We're helping. And there are elements of that. There's unquestionably elements of that. But China has among the most closed media in the entire planet. In fact, the International Journalists Association has rated 180 nations, and out of those, China rates 176. Okay, almost at the bottom in terms of media openness. And there's two kinds of media censorship that happen. There's so-called, the Great Firewall that they talk about. But basically, and I've tried many, many times to get things published in China, and it just does not happen. They have censors that actively censor, and under President Xi Jinping, they have become considerably tighter. Things have really been clamped down. But also, what you see is a very powerful passive kind of censorship in China. And that if we publish something about the Brazilian Amazon and said, here's a really dangerous project, it would get translated into Portuguese, and it would, John Paul, you know this, and it would go like wildfire across Brazil, and across the newspapers, and across the media. And Brazil is a relatively democratic country. Well, it was a relatively democratic country. Until very recently. Anyway, we shall see about that. But that does not happen in China. The Chinese people don't hear anything bad about the Belt and Road. All they hear is, quite frankly, propaganda. They hear about and a lot of developing countries are standing up and going, we want Belt and Road investment. We want investment. We want this money. And all they hear is the wonderful things that the Belt and Road is going to do. And so that the decisions tend to get made at a national level when the public tends to get engaged in an issue. But Chinese leaders don't have any that kind of pressure happening at all. And here's some other things that are about the Belt and Road. Number one, President Xi Jinping got the Belt and Road inscribed within the central charter of the Communist Party. That means it's illegal for any Chinese national to criticize it. Okay? And so this has an absolute chilling, freezing effect on any kind of criticism or even really open dialogue within China. He's now become essentially the leader of China for life. China is very actively opposes and combats and tries to thwart criticism, and it works at all kinds of levels. You see this. But according to President Xi, the Belt and Road is going to be low carbon, it's going to be circular, it's going to be sustainable, it's going to be green. That's the kind of words that have been used since the introduction of the Belt and Road. And he's a very intelligent man, a very intelligent operator. That is the propaganda that's being used to describe the Belt and Road. But I would argue that, in fact, it is not playing out that way, and it will not play out that way. And it's going to be overwhelmingly the biggest tsunami and avalanche of infrastructure we've ever seen on the planet Earth, affecting every inhabited continent, including North America, if we call Mexico part of North America, which we should. And it's only probably going to get bigger. Now, what I want to do now is come back to just the general thing of infrastructure and say, look, infrastructure's got a lot of risks, a lot of hidden risks, and what are some practical things that we can do to try to talk about these kinds of issues? Because they're big issues, but they're going to affect a lot of people in a lot of ways. One of the things I think we can do, and this I mean as scientists, I think we have to build a broad church. We can't just talk about monkeys and orangutans and, look, we have been fortunate to have audiences with a lot of high-ranking individuals in different countries, and we're able to get in and talk to the prime ministers and the presidents and their offices and things like that, and head of ministries, and they don't let us in the door because we're coming and talking about monkeys and orangutans and elephants. They let us because we're coming and talking about a much broader development agenda that's in their own interest. Okay, so I think that one of the things we have to really do is build a broad church. We have to talk about an economic, financial, political, social, all the senses about what's going on. And really, I would argue very strongly that these kinds of issues are almost inseparable. One of the key things about, if you look at the literature behind infrastructure and big infrastructure projects, one of the things you really see is that the economic benefits are oftentimes very seriously exaggerated relative to what's actually delivered. And one of the things that you see, particularly when people are talking about infrastructure as a mechanism, for instance, for combating poverty, is you find that there's extreme variability. So this is one of the things that a sort of a literature review reveals, is an extreme variation in the effectiveness of the different projects in terms of the economic benefits and the equitability of the economic benefits. So I think that's an important thing we've got to emphasize. One of the key things you really see, some people always get really rich off these projects, okay? There's always certain people, and they're usually key government decision makers and things like land developers. Now these guys always make a bundle, and they're always in really powerful positions, and they've got a lot of forces and a lot of capacity to influence public opinion. Those guys, this is in fact what we see, a lot of these development projects are really being propelled by this kind of dynamic, and with a lot of money being passed around under the table. Corruption is just a tremendously big and important, inexorable part of this problem. And one of the things that you do see is that developing nations do have much more challenges with corruption. They don't have the governance. Countries like Australia are pretty well governed, New Zealand, Scandinavian countries, I mean, we can go across the board, and what you actually see is that there's a fairly tight correlation between, say, overall average per capita GDP, how wealthy a country is and how well governed it is. And the poorer countries really do struggle. And what you see as a consequence of that is that a lot of projects that I think are extremely ill-advised are getting approved. And we've got videos and things about this. I don't have time to talk about things like the so-called Dutch disease and other things like that. But actually what you can see in many cases is that projects that are not well designed can actually harm a nation economically much more than it can help it. And it can harm poor people more than they're being helped. And it's not that difficult for that to do, but I don't have time to talk about it. But we also tend to see, for instance, that a lot of the funding from the project, let's say for a large dam project or a lot of road project, ends up getting gobbled up by cartels and by others involved in the construction. So for instance, a company might have a requirement to put in 70 centimeters of road base, but actually they just put in 30 centimeters and they end up pocketing the difference. This happens so commonly. Okay, so this is, and the World Bank figures here estimate that 15 to 30% and up to 60% of the total investment for the infrastructure itself, which the country is paying for. The country is usually borrowing the money, and they have to pay back, or they're squandering they're leveraging their natural resources in order to pay for it. They've got to pay for this. It's not a free lunch, but yet a lot of that's being lost, and it's being slipping down rat holes. A lot of stolen revenues are happening in many places. What you tend to see is, in many cases, when infrastructure projects are moving out into frontier areas, it's almost a Wild West scenario. People like John Paul and others who've seen what's happened in the Brazilian Amazon. There's a lot of changes that have happened over, but if you go back into the 1980s, the 1990s, early 2000s, even the Brazilian government estimated that more than 80% of all the logging in the Amazon was illegal. Stanford University and Carnegie estimated it was 90 to 95% of the timber. So imagine that the government's saying more than 80%, Stanford and Carnegie saying 95% roughly of all the timber coming out of the Amazon is stolen. Okay, that means no payment of government royalties, it's just coming out, it's just being taken illegally. Indonesia is currently losing an estimated $3 to $5 billion a year, money that could be used for hospitals, schools, a country that needs the money is being lost to illegal logging. Here's one that just hit I don't know if you guys are following this latest thing here, in Malaysia's big scandal. This is absolutely tied in with the Belt and Road. This money came from China to fund Chinese corporations that were mostly employing Chinese workers to build Chinese-funded railways and gas line projects in Malaysia, in peninsular Malaysia. About $40 billion was involved overall. And the former president, Najib, of Malaysia, through this one MDB entity that he set it up. Now, they originally thought it was $1 billion, and now it looks like it's about $5 billion. And much of that was actually money that was coming in for this Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, it was supposed to be being used to build railroads, high-speed railways, and pipelines and other kinds of infrastructure for the country. It was going into overseas bank accounts for the Prime Minister and for his cronies. Okay, if this has only become to light because he's out of power now, and because his successor is now he's under indictment. He may even be in prison right now. I'm not sure. But anyway, even Leonardo DiCaprio got caught up in this. I mean, this thing has gone global. I mean, this is just the scale of how much is going on. So it's a giant mess. Okay, and it's happened all because of this amazing amount of money flowing around for infrastructure. In the Southeast Asia, year after year is this terrible haze problem. A study that came out of Harvard University estimated that somewhere on the order of around 100,000 people per year were dying prematurely as a result of the haze problem. We know that there's been big increases in respiratory distress, in closure of schools, in closure of airports, and many other environmental and social effects as a consequence of this incredible haze, which is caused by burning of forests and especially burning of the peat swamps in Southeast Asia. Happens year in and year out. By the way, here's an area, this is actually in Bolivia right here, but this is an area with logging roads, and the areas in red are fires, and you don't have to look at that very closely to see that there's a really strong correlation between where the roads are and the fires are. But in Asia, what we see again year in, year out is this haze problem, so-called haze problem. I want to make the case that this is not just an environmental problem. This is a social problem, this is an economic problem, this is a political problem, it's a financial problem. You cannot separate the tentacles of the octopus on this and just talk about this in environmental terms, and we shouldn't be. That's the key thing. When we're talking about these issues, we need to say they're affecting everybody and they're affecting everything. That's where we're going to get the traction. That's how we're going to influence people. Okay? Water quality. My goodness, I mean, you take an area that's a forested watershed and you rip the forest away, what happens to the water quality? The water flow regimes and the quality of the water and the sediment loads and the pollution loads and oftentimes cities and others, not to mention industrial users and especially agriculture, the impacts that these things have. People do understand water issues, and it is an important one to talk about. Again, it's an environmental issue, but it transcends that. It puts things into a language that people understand. One of the other things that we're really seeing with a lot of this, incredible trillions of dollars are in investment going in right now into roads in tropical areas, wet tropical environments. And I can tell you what, those are the high rainfall environments, and oftentimes areas with steep topography or low-lying topography. They are just about the most difficult places on the planet to build and engineer roads, okay? If they're in low-lying areas, you need to have adequate road bases and you need to have lots of culverts in order to drain the water away. In high areas, you tend to have a really high incidence of landslides and of slumping, where you tend to get this below-surface water flow and it causes the road surface to sink and crack. That's some slumping that's happening right there. So you've got a $10 million or $50 million highway project that's being built, and within 4 or 5 years, it's almost unusable because there's whole sections along it that the traffic, instead of being able to go 100 kilometers or 80 kilometers an hour, say for instance to get an agricultural commodity to an urban market or to an export area, but fast enough so that it doesn't spoil, so, so it's economically viable. Instead of being able to go 80 kilometers an hour, they keep hitting these bottlenecks in the road where there's giant potholes or there's slumps or whatever, and the traffic bottlenecks, and it slows down, and they end up going 15 kilometers an hour on average. I can tell you so many stories about tropical roads. But here's the problem. The countries that are doing these projects, they're putting money out there for development of the road, but they're not, in many cases, we estimate, and also the World Bank estimates, that between 10 to 20% of the total investment of the road, the capital investment, needs to be allocated each year to maintain the road in a high rainfall environment. Okay? So you're going to spend $1 billion, you need to be ready to spend $100 to $200 million a year in order to maintain that road in these kinds of extreme environments, and yet we're not seeing that happening. This is one of the most powerful arguments against the current incredible tsunami of road building happening in the tropics right now. A lot of these things are going to be squandered, wasted investments, and developing countries are going to end up holding the bag for this. And boy, I'll tell you what, and I'm sorry to come back to China and pick on China, but China is overwhelming. It's not the only entity by far, but China is so involved in so many of these issues right now. So now, to come back to biodiversity, which is something I know that we care about in a group like this, what kinds of things can we do to try to help biodiversity in given the onslaught? I mean, I think, so, some things, people talk a lot about infrastructure, and you tend to hear this phrase, well, greening infrastructure. We want to make infrastructure green. So what are the things that we can do to green infrastructure, to make it better, to make it more environmentally safe and environmentally benign? There are things we can do, okay? There are things that we can do to make infrastructure better. So for instance, in forested environments, one of the things you can do is make the road really narrow so that you maintain some canopy connections overhead. We know that in forests, and particularly in tropical environments, you get a lot of very specialized arboreal species never come down to the ground. That Tapanuli orangutan I mentioned, the orangutans are the most arboreal of all the apes. The Tapanuli orangutan is the most arboreal of all the orangutans. In 3,000 hours of observations, it's never been seen on the ground alive. You only see it in trees. It's absolutely arboreal. You only find it where there's dense tree cover, okay? That's an example of one of these strictly arboreal species, of which there's lots of them. So one of the things we can do is we can maintain those canopy connections. Now, road engineers hate that because the road doesn't dry out. But anyway, that's something you can do. Keep the roads really narrow. You can create these sort of artificial walkways. This is something my friend Miriam Goosen did up in North Queensland in the World Heritage Area. And actually, these work, for relatively narrow roads for certain species. And that's a lemuroid ringtail possum, which is actually a fairly forest-dependent, it's a forest-dependent possum. It's actually using one of these road bridges. So that's something in certain kinds of places where you've got money and law enforcement and things like that, you could potentially do in high priority environments. We can do things like speed bumps. We know the drivers don't like them very much, but they actually work. Drivers actually hate them, but the speed bumps, especially if you make those kind of really wicked short little speed bumps, they work. They slow things down, and there are places where that helps. Overpasses and underpasses. One of my PhD students studied 18 of these underpasses in Malaysia to try to see what kind of impacts or benefits that they might have for wildlife using camera trapping. And unfortunately, one of the things he found is that they really, for the species that we're really worried about, they're not really very effective at all. A good example is forest elephants. Tigers was one priority, but one of the things they really wanted to do, because they're clearing and they're building roads everywhere in peninsular Malaysia, they wanted to try to be able to say, well, we can do this and we'll build these underpasses and the wildlife will be okay, because they can just go underneath the road. So one of the things that they did is or anywhere around these underpasses, they put electric fences up along, for kilometers in each direction, because they didn't want the elephants crossing the roads where they might get hit by a car. They wanted them to go into the underpasses. Well, it turns out that the elephants were quite intelligent. And it turns out the elephants will do one of two things when they come up to one of these electric fences. One thing is that they'll take a tree and they'll knock the tree down, and that'll knock over the electric fence, and then they just cross where they want. Or they'll go up to where their buddy is, and they'll go to their buddy, and they'll knock their buddy into the electric fence, and then they cross. But the bottom line is, where an elephant wants to cross the road, the elephant crosses the road. And that's just the way wildlife works in most cases. We can build these little underpasses and other kinds of things like this, and quite frankly, a lot of this stuff, it's pretty boutique-y, you know? Makes us feel better. Oh, we're spending some money, we're doing some nice things, we're helping wildlife, but the example I use is a bit like treating cancer with a Band-Aid, okay? And when you see that how the real Wild West dynamics work in a lot of these places, this stuff, and you see the environmental impact statements say this all the time. Oh, we'll just do this. We'll make some underpasses. We'll do a little culvert. We'll do a little rope bridge, and it'll all be fine. Don't believe it. One of the things that I think greening really means is screening. By that, I mean calling out projects and saying that project should not happen. That's, I think, the most critical thing that we've been missing in this dialogue is it's stopping the ill-advised projects. There are so many of these projects that are ill-advised. This is a quantitative analysis we did using completely transparent criteria for assessing 33 major development corridors that are either underway or proposed for sub-Saharan Africa, a total length of about 53,000 kilometers. These will absolutely change Africa in every sense of the word. They're mostly being driven by mining investments, but they're being promoted as being, promoting agriculture and food security and all this kinds of stuff. When we actually looked at these using data that anybody can find, we found that only 6 of them out of the 33 seem to have defensible economics behind them. Okay, so anyway, the bottom line is when you look at these projects and you actually look at them using information that anybody can see and understand, a lot of them turn out not to be very good ideas. And these projects can have incredible developments. This is just one example right here. This is the first major highway that was completed in the Brazilian Amazon. It was completed in the early 1970s between Belém, here at the mouth of the Amazon, and Brasilia, which is the national capital. We know how to identify the dangerous projects. We know how to say the ones that are going to be really dangerous. We know right now. We know if you're going to cut deep into the interior of a forest that you could have incredible environmental impacts. That road, when it was completed in the 1970s, was just a razor-thin cut through the forest. Today, it's about a 400-kilometer wide swath of forest destruction across the eastern Brazilian Amazon. Now, you could have predicted back then what was going to happen. And we know it happens again and again and again. Stop the first cut. That's the message. When you've got an area of intact forest, just don't put the first road in. Stop that first cut whenever you possibly can. That is the thing. That's the next slide. Stop the first cut, because once that first cut comes in, it's essentially like cancer. You get deforestation spreading like a series of tumors along that road, and then you get secondary roads and tertiary roads, oftentimes illegal roads coming off of that, and the cancer metastasizes. It spreads. And you get deforestation spreading just like that. And the pattern happens over and over and over again. And it all follows from that first road. And the governments will say, oh, well, we can control, we put in the road and we can control what's going to happen. And we know, we've got regulations. It rarely works. And if it does work, it requires continual expenditure and monitoring and enforcement. It's a very expensive ongoing expense. Another thing we can do, establishing protected areas along a road route before road construction does help, no question. Not completely effective, but it definitely does help. So that's one thing that's useful. Another key thing we can do is when we have protected areas, we need to have some roads for tourism and amenities and all that type of thing. But ideally what we want to do is have a road go to a beautiful waterfall and go to certain areas, but keep a large core area of that park road free, or essentially have some place where nature can persist without omnipresent human activity. That's a strategy that works pretty well. And ultimately, I think what we have to do is promote strategic planning. Right now, what we're doing with our environmental impact assessments, and you see it everywhere, is we look at one project, one at a time, and that's only we looked at that one project. But nature is dying a death of 1,000 cuts. And what is the point of studying one cut at a time? The point is, we need strategic planning to look at the net impact of all of these different projects, the tsunami, the avalanche, all of these different things happening simultaneously. That's what's impacting nature, is the totality of all this stuff, not one thing happening at a time. So the bottom line is, I think, when we look at all this stuff in terms of what's happening, we are seeing, without a doubt, the greatest threat, in my opinion, to biodiversity and to the environment that we've ever seen in our history on this planet, but it also has much wider impacts on human societies and economies and finances and politics and ultimately for human welfare. We've all got a giant stake in this thing. It's something that I think we really need to think about and to focus on. So, thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Bill. If you need to go, I know we've run out of time, but are you happy to stay for a few more minutes?
Sure.
A couple of questions?
My question pertains to the BRI. If we look at it from the financial risk perspective, a lot of these projects are facing debt sustainability issues. Investors are not getting their money back, and especially the private Chinese commercial banks, they are not interested in the BRI anymore, but the state keeps pushing the policy banks to invest for its own geopolitical ambitions. But do you think eventually, there was a study that 12% of these BRI projects have been stalled for some reason or the other, and anecdotal evidence says that it could be environmental reasons, regulation, protests. But do you think eventually the market would be able to put brakes on something as enormous as the BRI?
I think the market's probably the best chance, the most realistic limitation on the BRI is going to be the markets. And it's going to be, now this is where the environment and where social issues and other things play in, because in fact, if you look at the International, not the International Monetary Fund, the Christine Lagarde, sorry, is it IMF? Yeah, the IMF, Christine Lagarde, actually argued that about a third of the Belt and Road projects were financially insolvent, according to their assessments. And it was because of environmental and social, but also financial, political, other kinds of reasons too. There's a whole conversation that we could have here about both the impacts on Chinese investors, and as you well know, China's foreign debt has increased dramatically. We're starting to actually hear, even inside China, rumblings about the increase in debt. The Chinese economy is finally starting to slow down. We know that the state, the Chinese state, if you say it's a Belt and Road project, it suddenly becomes very easy to move your capital overseas. You want overseas, whereas if it's not, it's much more complicated. So it's becoming part of the Belt and Road has enormous benefits for any company. The banks and the lenders, financiers, both of all sorts, I think are starting to realize the risks. There's also a lot of risk for the host nations. People have been talking about debt traps, and all the issues around that. And we can go off on that for a long time. So yes, I actually think that it's going to be macroeconomic factors and probably, but the key thing is this: by being an active part of this conversation, we influence this thing. This dial is moving, and we can have a big impact on all the dialogue that's going on around this, which is influencing all these projects. But I agree, actually, the best hope. Also, the one thing we can't forget is that if you look at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and a lot of the other Chinese plans, it's not just Chinese money. In fact, current assessments, as I understand it, and again, it's cloudy, is that China's currently committed to put about $1 trillion into Belt and Road projects in one way or another. That they're expecting the rest of the world to fund the remainder of that $8 trillion. Okay, so what that means is, and people say to me, oh, you can't criticize China because China's a face-saving society, and if you say anything to offend China, they just won't listen to you and they'll shut you out immediately. And I say, I'm not trying to talk to China. I'm trying to talk to all the investors that are not Chinese and to explain to them in the host nations and for them to understand what the risks and realities are. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's very interesting that investors inside China, as you say, the non-state banks, are starting to get nervous too, because a lot of these projects, for various reasons, are failing. And one of the things that we do see is a lot of these infrastructure projects do fail. Even they're big, heavy-duty projects. And there's a reason why the proponents try to ram them through and railroad them through really fast before people have time to think about it and stop and argue about it and debate about it and say, wait a second, there's an endangered species that lives there. We shouldn't be doing this. Or we should change it. And they say, wait a minute, they don't want that. That's the exact opposite. They don't want that kind of public debate. So, good point. I think it's probably going to be the way a lot of this stuff plays out realistically. But again, remember, environment, economy, finance, politics, society, economics, it's all tied in together. That's really what I'm saying. Yes?
Yes, sir. So in an East African context, toxic debt for these roads. Like, for example, Uganda, where I work, that's a pretty good example. A lot of people are a lot of the community members on these projects are becoming angry. For example, in Zambia, there was 5 Chinese nationals installed into the local police service. Last year, there was that massive racist Twitter rant by one of the Chinese nationals at some Kenyan guys. So slowly the people are becoming aware as to what's happening and how they're becoming dispossessed. But what I wanted to know is, like, legally and financially, eventually when people get fed up, is there anything that they can actually do to, keep these guys out? Like, what can they do? Yeah.
Good question. We work quite a lot in Africa, and we really see this kind of tension that you're talking about between locals and all the Chinese expatriates that are working in Africa. And they complain a lot. You hear, the everyday people say, the Chinese, here's the things that they say. Firstly, they say they bribe like nobody else has ever bribed. They say, look, the Europeans used to come in and they bribed, but they called them presents. And this is what they say. When they gave gifts, they spread them around. They made sure everybody got something. That was the way it worked, and it was understood, and it was how business was done. Everybody from the bottom level to the middle level to the top, everybody got something, and it was modest, but everybody got it. So the Chinese operators come in and they go straight to the top, right to the minister, and they bribe that top minister and his cabal, and then everybody else has to fall in line. Africa does not have the history of democracy that many other places in the world does, as you know, with the tribal history. So what you tend to see in many cases, in fact, is I think it's very difficult. It depends on the country, of course. There's a lot of diversity in Africa, but freedom of the degree to which the media and other things are free. But I think it's extremely difficult in many circumstances for upset locals because the other things that they say, about Chinese is that they're tight-fisted, that they only want to employ Chinese, they don't want to employ locals. They say a lot of stuff like that, and it sounds stereotypical, but that's what you hear. And they say they don't, and they're very cliquey. They tend to they don't integrate with the rest of the Africans, so the Africans feel as though they're being exploited. Are they going to be? I don't know if upset local. I've had many exchanges with people that are upset, or personal exchanges with people that are very, very angry in Africa about what's happening. I don't see that really stopping a lot of projects. I think other things might be in cases, but it's not been a lot of grassroots things. But maybe the anger will reach in Africa, you can do sometimes, in places, you'll see things just blow up. And then suddenly that does get everybody's attention. And suddenly people go crazy and something really crazy happens. In Indonesia and New Guinea, you're familiar with the big road projects that are happening up there, cutting through into some of the most incredible remote indigenous lands, and the Indonesian government's got this very top-down control. That's partly a lot of Chinese money involved in that too. There was just local indigenous group, or not group, what's the word? Insurrection just killed 19 road workers up there, and security people. So the road building up there has just stopped, and it's because of this exact same kind of anger and frustration and feeling as though their traditional lands are being taken away, they're being exploited, they're being ripped off, they're being overrun. So that's when things do happen. That's maybe, sadly, in a lot of societies where there's not the kind of democracy. At least here we can read about it and people can talk about it, So I actually fear for Africa pretty deeply. First, so yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the depressing talk, 4 hours.
Pleasure. Not pleasure.
I was wondering if you have any examples of countries that are doing this development correctly, as opposed to all of the ones that are sort of railroaded by development.
Look, there's a huge amount of variation. Costa Rica has been a country that's had, you know, a big wave of development in the past and is now reforesting. There's a, you know, there's been a country where there's that kind of thing's happening. I can tell, I mean, I just instantly what springs to mind is all the countries that are going in the wrong direction right now, like really fast, like Brazil. It's just, President Bolsonaro has just suddenly come in, and Brazil, a country where, where things had gotten a lot better. Paul again, Metzger will know very well, but you know, Brazil was losing more than 2 million hectares of forest, so twice the area of the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area every year being destroyed, and lots of other, probably more than that because a lot of it wasn't even being picked up, it turns out. But anyway, then in about 2006, it just suddenly started dropping, and it dropped and dropped and dropped, and it fell by about 80%. Turned out there was quite an amazing social reason why that all happened. But bottom line is, now what you've got is kind of a president that's been elected. A lot of people are calling him the tropical Trump because he's very authoritarian and populist and completely aggressively pro-development, who wants to change all that and really throw the Amazon back in time. But I think, and by the way, I'll just tell you the one thing that triggered a lot of that stuff in Brazil was some cattle ranchers murdered a Catholic nun who was trying to protect some indigenous people. So in Brazil, you don't kill Catholic nuns. So anyway, they send in the army. Yeah.
Well, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I worked in the past in Yasuni.
Yasuni.
And I was I was for a year there, and with the drilling of the oil and the road is some of the that's as you said, one of the worst things that happens afterwards. They were suggesting or discussing about the idea of doing all the transport of the drilling by air. What do you think? And I don't know. There was a conversation.
Yeah.
It's not needed. So
Yeah.
is that enough?
Yeah. Well, look at people talk about these so-called offshore projects, and the what was Camisea in Peru? Now there was actually, that's a gigantic natural gas project, Camisea, where they actually tried initially to do the so-called offshore development, which is essentially bringing in by helicopter a lot of the equipment. And also they built a pipeline, but the idea of the pipeline was that they were going to allow the forest, it was underground, and then they were going to allow the forest to regenerate. Now that collapsed, unfortunately. Just a lot of people were looking at that. These kinds of projects, these so-called offshore projects, and Yasuni, some people would argue would be the most important protected area in the Amazon in terms of, you know, species richness. Quite possibly it is, and it's being opened up, as you well know, by. In fact, you know, the government. Well, at the one hand, the government actually told the world that if you pay us half of the value of the oil revenues, natural gas revenues underneath the park, we won't do it. At the same time, they were actually negotiating with the Chinese to do the project. And of course, the world couldn't come up with the amount of money. The world raised 30 million, and they wanted 300 million. So now they've gone ahead with the projects and the roads, and they're seeing all the issues, these encroachment and other things happening. The bottom line is that the problem with the offshore projects is they sound great, they're just so expensive. I mean, imagine imagine you couldn't build a hydroelectric dam or a big mine, or there's not very many things you can build by helicoptering things in. I mean, it sounds good, but it's so expensive, and so it's one of these really, really extreme boutique solutions. It sounds great, but the reality is it's, you know, really, really rare. Very, very few cases, sadly, where we've seen it happen. And if it's not going to happen in Yasuni, which is a jewel, you know, perhaps you know, one of the greatest jewels of the Amazon or the world, then where would it happen? Well, on that note, I thank you all for sharing a really enjoyable hour with me, and I apologize if I've ruined anybody's lunch. Thanks a lot.